Richard was 63 years old. It was a Tuesday morning, and he was sitting on the floor of his own living room, looking around, unable to get up. Not because his body had failed, but because, for the first time in his life, that entire house felt like it belonged to someone else. The furniture, the pictures on the wall, the keys on the table. Everything felt connected to a version of life that was already over, but somehow still sitting there. His wife had died a year and a half earlier. His children lived in other states. The phone rang less often, and the house sounded louder empty than it ever had when it was full. For weeks, Richard had been feeling something difficult to explain. He would open the refrigerator and forget what he was going to grab. He woke up at 3 a.m. completely alert. His heart would start racing when the house became quiet. And sometimes, for a few seconds, he barely recognized his own life. Let me show you what was happening inside Richard's brain in that moment, because you probably know someone living through something similar, or maybe you're living through it right now. And most importantly, what was happening to Richard was much more physical and much more common than he realized. Most people imagine aging as a slow loss of energy, but what many people experience after 60 is something very different. It's as if multiple structures of life start collapsing at the same time. Your career changes, your marriage changes, your body changes, your social roles change, and the brain, which spent decades using those structures as references for safety, suddenly has to figure out how to function without them. Researchers who study later life transitions describe a very specific psychological state, the feeling that the entire structure of life stopped making sense all at once. And here's the problem. A lot of people interpret this as weakness, depression, lack of gratitude, or an inability to move on. But the brain often interprets this experience differently, as a threat. And that completely changes what happens inside the body. There's something happening to many older adults that is rarely described correctly. They're not just sad, they're biologically disorganized, because the human brain is extremely efficient at handling isolated losses. We have emotional mechanisms for that. The problem begins when multiple identity anchors disappear almost at the same time. Think about what sustains the feeling of continuity in a life: routine, function, people, places, goals, predictability. Now imagine losing several of those things within just a few years. A partner dies, retirement arrives, your social circle shrinks, your body changes, your children move on with their own lives, and suddenly the brain has to answer an incredibly uncomfortable question: who am I now? But it doesn't answer that question in philosophical language. It answers in body chemistry. That's why so many people describe symptoms that seem completely disconnected. You wake up tired even after sleeping. Your heart races for no clear reason. Small decisions start consuming absurd amounts of energy. You walk into a room and forget why you went there. And sometimes the worst part isn't even the forgetfulness. It's the strange feeling of not fully recognizing yourself inside your own routine anymore. That does not mean you're losing your mind, and it does not automatically mean neurodegenerative disease. Very often, it's the nervous system reacting to a profound loss of predictability. And this is where most people misunderstand what's happening, because they keep trying to solve it with positive thinking, or productivity, or distraction, when what the brain is actually asking for is something else: safety. When a person loses central structures of identity too quickly, The brain often interprets that as biological threat, not emotional threat, biological threat. And that's important to understand because the human brain does not perfectly separate "I lost my marriage" from "I'm in danger." For certain brain regions, the chemical experience can feel surprisingly similar. The part of the brain responsible for detecting threat becomes more reactive. The stress system starts releasing cortisol in irregular ways, and the entire body feels it. Sleep changes, memory changes, emotional tolerance changes, energy changes. Researchers studying prolonged grief and major life transitions in older adults have observed a very consistent pattern. The body often enters a low-grade, but chronic, state of alert, and that state wears people down, not overnight, slowly, silently. That's why some people begin experiencing constant fatigue, difficulty concentrating, mental fog, unusual irritability, withdrawal, loss of motivation, or even diffuse physical symptoms that seem to have no explanation. The body is trying to understand, where did the safety I used to have go? And here's an important detail. The brain after 60 is still capable of reorganizing itself, very much so, but it does not reorganize well in an environment of continuous threat. And that explains something many doctors still underestimate. Time alone doesn't always heal this, because the brain doesn't just need the pain to fade, it needs to build new references for stability. And there's another part of this story that almost nobody explains correctly. The mature brain does not respond to chaos the same way a younger brain does. When we're younger, the brain tolerates instability better. There's more impulsivity, more novelty, more capacity for rapid reorganization. But after 60, the nervous system often starts prioritizing something else: predictability, coherence, emotional safety, rhythm. That is not weakness. It's biological adaptation. But modern culture keeps telling people at this stage of life, reinvent yourself, do more, start over, keep the same energy. And sometimes the brain simply doesn't want intensity anymore. It wants stability, and that's huge. Because many people start judging themselves for not reacting to life the same way they did decades earlier. But maybe the problem isn't incapacity. Maybe it's incompatibility between what the brain needs and what the culture demands. Richard spent almost 2 years interpreting his own collapse as personal failure. He believed he had given up on life. But what was happening was different. His nervous system was trying to reorganize an entire identity without the structures that used to support it. And reorganization consumes energy, a lot of it. Here's the part that changes everything. The opposite of psychological collapse is not always motivation. Sometimes it's enough stability for the brain to stop surviving, and that completely changes the approach. Because people at this stage often try to solve the problem the wrong way. They try to force themselves to go back to normal, stay distracted all the time, fill every silence, create huge goals, act as if nothing has changed. But the brain already knows something has changed, and it reacts when you try to ignore it. Your body is speaking. You just have to learn its language. Richard started getting better when he stopped trying to recover his old life and started building small new references instead. Small, not grand. He created routine, reduced expenses, simplified decisions, stopped trying to keep up with the emotional pace he had at 40, and slowly, his nervous system began to calm down. That sounds simple when described quickly. Living through it is not, because grief is involved, anger is involved, shame is involved. And there's the brutal feeling of looking at your own life and thinking, how did I end up here? But when a person understands that the brain is reacting biologically to a profound rupture, the guilt starts to decrease, and that reduces threat. And when threat decreases, the brain can finally begin reorganizing. 3 things seem to help a lot during this phase. First, name exactly what was lost. Not just, I lost my husband, but I lost the person who witnessed my daily life. I lost the person who shared decisions with me. I lost the person who silently validated my existence. The brain processes specific losses better than abstract ones. Second, create small anchors of continuity, not a new purpose in life. That places too much pressure on an already exhausted brain. An anchor, a predictable routine, a community, a regular walk, a recurring commitment. Something that tells the nervous system life still has structure. Third, reduce overstimulation during periods of emotional reorganization. This is the opposite of what culture suggests. The modern world treats reinvention like a performance, but exhausted brains often need stability first, not intensity. Sometimes the brain needs less stimulation, not more, and that's especially true after grief, retirement, financial loss, divorce, or abrupt identity changes. Because the brain after 60 is still capable of rebuilding a life. It just refuses to rebuild it the same way. And of course, the right approach is individual. If you're going through something similar, especially with persistent suffering, intense isolation, or depressive symptoms, talking to a mental health professional can make a real difference. Let's go back to Richard. He sat in that living room for a long time that day, looking at objects that no longer seemed connected to the same life. But eventually he stood up, not because he found some magical solution, but because he began to understand something fundamental. What he was experiencing was not simply emotional weakness. It was a nervous system trying to reorganize an entire life after losing too many references, too fast. And when he stopped fighting against his own rhythm, something started changing, slowly. But it changed because the human brain after 60 does not lose its ability to rebuild. It simply stops accepting violent forms of reconstruction. And maybe someone listening to this right now needed exactly this information. Because sometimes suffering becomes worse, not only because of the loss itself, but because of the guilt of not reacting the way you think you should. So let me finish by saying something important. If your life feels emotionally unrecognizable after major changes, that does not automatically mean you failed. Maybe your brain is trying to do exactly what it was designed to do: survive first and reorganize afterward. And if some part of this video felt uncomfortably familiar, maybe your brain is trying to show you something important about the stage of life you're living through right now. There are other videos here on the channel exploring these exact kinds of changes: grief, identity, loneliness, the brain, purpose, emotional aging. And maybe one of them is exactly the video you needed to hear today. See you in the next one.